Robert D. Morrow was an engineer. His work often was for the U.S. government, whether he knew it or not. He began working for CIA before he realized he was working for CIA. But once he became aware of it, that working relationship blossomed into a full-time role of CIA agent. And once in that role, he found himself aligned with a group within CIA who decided to defy and disobey the President of the United States. Those CIA agents, including himself, were aligned with the Mafia and with Cuban exiles. Those groups became aligned with certain key members of the U.S. federal government. Richard Nixon, for example. Then J. Edgar Hoover and Lyndon B. Johnson. Their goal was at first to deal with Cuba. That involved plans to invade the island nation and plans to assassinate its communist dictator Fidel Castro. But those plans were often at odds with the plans and wishes of John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy. CIA was at war with the Kennedy brothers, with the State Department, and at times even with itself. Out of that hostile environment grew an intense hatred for those who opposed them. That hatred evolved into a plan to kill JFK. Robert Morrow was not one of the snipers at Dealey Plaza on November 22, 1963. But he supplied the rifles and communication equipment for the 3 snipers who were there. Morrow didn't realize it at the time. Like most of the other conspirators, he didn't understand what was really happening until it was too late. This is my Reader's Digest version of his story, told in his book, First-Hand Knowledge, How I Participated in the CIA Mafia Murder of President Kennedy.
Robert Morrow lived in Baltimore and worked as a project engineer for Martin Aircraft Company. Martin's primary customer was the U.S. Defense Department, and most of Martin's revenue derived from DoD contracts for Air Force and Navy projects. Martin also was doing work for the new National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. The projects were varied, but they all had a common characteristic: stringent confidentiality and security requirements. They were pilot programs, requiring first that the advanced concepts or theoretical ideas had to be worked out on paper. Morrow was one of the engineers at Martin who would pick up from there, creating the hardware and making it work according to established parameters and specs. In the process, Morrow built up a reputation as a creative, pragmatic engineer who didn't shy away from challenging projects. He also, as much as possible, avoided bureaucracy in corporate work environment, preferring to work in his home-based laboratory, where he spent most of his working time. But eventually that led to a parting of the ways. In 1958 he established himself in Washington, D.C. as an engineering consultant. Another former Martin employee, Dr. Stan Clark, an expert in radiation effects, hired Morrow to help on a top-secret assignment for an unknown government agency. Morrow didn't know it yet, but that's when he began working for CIA. The assignment was to develop a means to render an enemy population helpless but very much alive. It must cause minimal physical damage to real property. Their solution involved the effects of radiation on the thyroid gland. By subjecting the enemy population to a certain radioactive isotope, those people would no longer have a functioning thyroid. The antidote was a compound called thyroxine, and the supply of it would be totally controlled by the attacker. Without it, individuals would die, leaving them under the absolute control of the attacker. People could function as normal as long as they followed orders. Otherwise they would be denied thyroxine and they wouldn't live long. The radiation could be distributed from a jet and the people wouldn't have any idea what was happening to them until it was too late. The problem was, the jet pilot wouldn't live long either, no matter how much he tried to shield himself from the radiation. Morrow's part in the project was wrapped up in July 1958. He never knew if the client liked the solution he and Clark came up with, or what, if anything, ever became of it. From there, Morrow worked on the creation of several new electronic devices for various companies. Then he happened to see an old friend, Ross Scheuer. Ross had gone through an extended rough patch and he jumped at the chance to work with Morrow. Scheuer found an ideal location for a combination office apartment in Washington to serve as Morrow's base of operations. His reputation as a competent scientist and electronics expert had grown in the area, and Scheuer still had valuable connections in the D.C. area. Morrow's attorney, Darwin Brown, introduced him to Marshall Diggs, former deputy comptroller of Franklin Roosevelt's Treasury Department. Morrow was just the guy Diggs was looking for to help one of Diggs' very respected clients, Mario Garcia Coley. What Coley wanted Diggs and Morrow to do was get rid of Fidel Castro. They were to find a way to destroy the communist dictator politically and kick him out of Cuba for good. Diggs told Morrow that a certain U.S. government agency was already working on a project to accomplish that mission. What they needed was someone with the technical skills to do a wide variety of unusual jobs, the expertise to tackle important communication projects immediately. Someone who was not connected with the intelligence community or with any Cuban nationals. What they needed was Morrow. For the next several months Morrow was focused on developing and supplying Coley's forces with communications gear and other things. The two of them worked very closely together, fostering mutual trust and respect. On March 17, 1960, President Eisenhower authorized covert action against Castro. It involved creating a Cuban government in exile and a covert intelligence and action group inside Cuba. Coley already had those agenda items in place. It also involved launching a major propaganda campaign and creating a paramilitary force outside of Cuba for guerrilla action at some point. CIA would take care of those agenda items. The propaganda offensive fell to David Atlee Phillips, a propaganda specialist. The paramilitary force was in the hands of Tracy Barnes and E. Howard Hunt, of future Watergate infamy. While working with Coley took up most of Morrow's time as associate, Ross Scheuer took over most of the commercial projects Morrow had been working on. Soon their office apartment was also occupied by Amy, who became Robert's secretary and lover even though he still had a wife at home in Baltimore. He and his wife Cecily began drifting apart since her father's suicide in 1956. He didn't tell her about Amy. At the end of March 1960, Diggs assigned Morrow the task of delivering a truckload of electronic equipment to Usep Island off the west coast of Florida. He was to install the equipment, test it, and make sure it all worked smoothly. In June Diggs summoned Morrow to his home for a meeting. There he was introduced to Mr. Brown, and Morrow was asked to explain to Mr. Brown his work for Mr. Coley. It was a strange request, but Diggs nodded his approval and Morrow proceeded to explain the nature of his work for Coley, wrapping it up in about 10 minutes. Neither Diggs nor Brown seemed very interested and Morrow was soon escorted to the door. Diggs explained that Mr. Brown represented one of the financial backers of Coley's project, the Mafia. Only later did Morrow learn that Mr. Brown was really New York's Mafia Don Thomas Lucchese. A couple of days later Morrow was summoned to Diggs' office, where he met once again with Mr. Brown and another man introduced as Tracy Barnes, deputy to CIA's Richard Bissell, deputy director of plans and head of covert operations. Barnes asked if Morrow would be interested in doing some special projects for Coley. Yes. As Morrow left, Diggs cautioned Morrow to not mention the meeting to anyone. After spending the weekend in Baltimore, Morrow received another call from Diggs on Monday morning, inviting him to meet again at Diggs' home, this time to discuss on Tuesday one of those special projects Barnes had mentioned. Something big was on, Diggs told him. When he arrived, parked cars clogged the street and driveway. Extra chairs were brought to the study to accommodate the group. The speaker was Eladio del Valle, who introduced several Cubans who had recently escaped from Cuba. He then turned the floor over to Coley, who announced that people in the current administration had for weeks been reviewing Coley's plan for the future government of Cuba. It included many of the people present at the meeting. Having succeeded in forming the de facto Cuban government in exile, now the group could be assured of the help needed to regain control of their homeland. He cautioned them to be very careful about who they talked to about this, because Castro had agents all over Miami, some of which were considered friends. They would meet again in a few weeks.